Some legacies aren't carried in medals, they're worn in silence. Harrison Ford never talked much about the fire in Snake River Canyon, not even to his granddaughter. But one rainy morning in Wyoming, she came to him with a question he couldn't ignore. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was quiet, and it cut deeper than any storm. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. Emily Ford walked through the front gates of Grayson Hills Elementary with her shoulders tucked in and her eyes on the gravel path. The morning sun caught the frayed edges of the oversized flight jacket wrapped around her small frame. It hung past her knees, the faded olive fabric buckled in places from age and weather. The cuffs were rolled up several times but still swallowed her wrists, and the collar had lost its stiffness long ago. To most of her classmates, it looked like something rescued from a forgotten trunk in a dusty attic, or worse, a thrift store. But to Emily, it felt like armor. A group of girls stood near the flagpole, laughter bubbling behind manicured smiles and glossy backpacks. Madison Jenkins, whose family owned half the businesses lining Main Street, tilted her head just enough for the light to bounce off her pearl-studded headband. Her voice, too polished for a 10-year-old, rang out like a warning shot. "Look, it's the aviation hobo again." A few others giggled. "She looks like she borrowed that from a World War II museum," another added. "Maybe she sleeps in hangars." Emily kept walking. She had learned not to respond, not because it didn't sting, but because any reaction only added fuel. Her sneakers were silent against the concrete, but the comments weren't. "I bet she thinks people will think her grandpa's a hero or something," someone behind her said. "Probably just some old guy who used to pump gas for airplanes." More laughter. Emily said nothing. Her locker was on the bottom row, tucked beneath the glare of a flickering fluorescent light. She crouched, spun the lock 3 times, and opened the door with a quiet clunk. Inside were her notebooks, her pencil case, and a folded paper towel covering a peanut butter sandwich. She reached in slowly, methodically, as if any quick movement might make her more visible than she already felt. The jacket rustled with every motion, like dry leaves brushing the ground in autumn. She sat back on her heels and rested one hand over the left side of her chest, pressing gently where the jacket's fabric had grown thin. There, nearly invisible, was the outline of an old embroidered patch, its colors faded to ash, its stitching almost erased by time. She traced it softly with her fingers. No one else seemed to notice it. No one knew what it once meant, but Emily did. At least, she thought she did. A bell rang overhead, jolting the hallway to life. Backpacks zipped, sneakers squeaked, and students flooded the corridor like a river breaking through. Emily rose slowly, pushing her sleeves back for the 3rd time that morning. She turned toward her classroom, walking straight through the tide of motion and noise like a stone in the stream. Behind her, Madison watched with narrowed eyes. "What a weirdo," she muttered, "like some costume's going to make her important." But Emily didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. Her fingers were still brushing the edge of the old patch, still warm from her touch, still there, even if the world refused to see it. The cabin stood quietly at the edge of the pine line, its wood faded by years of wind and sun. Inside the detached garage, a single bulb hung low over a workbench, casting long shadows across jars of screws, tins of oil, and the outline of an old seaplane carved in balsa wood. Harrison Ford sat hunched over the bench, silver hair falling over his brow, eyes narrowed as he adjusted the tiny propeller with tweezers and a steady hand. Outside, the wind rustled the pine needles like whispers from another time. Emily stood at the threshold, watching him. She didn't speak at first. The air smelled like sawdust and machine grease, and the only sound was the soft creak of the stool as Harrison shifted his weight. On the far wall, 3 maps were pinned side by side, their corners curling with age. One of them was older than she was, creased, worn, and marked in faded red pencil that traced the outline of the Snake River Canyon. She stepped in. The wooden floor beneath her sneaker groaned, and Harrison glanced over his shoulder. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened just a little. I was thinking," Emily began, picking at the corner of her sleeve. "Maybe I shouldn't wear the jacket anymore." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set down the propeller gently and wiped his fingers on a cloth. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "I wouldn't be upset," he said. His voice was low, roughened by time and smoke and things that don't get talked about. "But you ought to ask yourself why you wore it in the first place." Emily looked down. Her sneakers had a new layer of dirt from the schoolyard. A scuff on the toe she hadn't noticed before. "I thought maybe it made me look brave," she whispered. "Like you." Harrison finally turned. His gaze was level but not hard. He studied her face, not for signs of defiance, but for something deeper. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "Brave isn't how something looks," he said. "It's what you do when nobody's watching." She didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, long but not empty. He turned back to the bench and picked up the wooden wing again, sliding it gently into place. Emily stepped closer, drawn by something she didn't quite understand. Her eyes drifted across the bench and landed on the old map. Yellowed, torn at one edge. Red lines curved around an area near the North Ridge, tiny handwritten notes she couldn't read. She reached out, almost touched it. "What's that?" she asked. Harrison didn't look up. "Nothing important," he said, though the words caught slightly in his throat. Emily didn't press. She sensed there was a door there, an old one, and it wasn't ready to be opened yet. Instead, she pulled the jacket tighter around her, more out of habit than cold. "Do people ever forget the things you've done?" she asked softly. He paused. The sound of the wind outside filled the space where an answer might have gone. Then he spoke, almost too quiet to hear. "Most of the time," he said, "but that's not why you do them." Emily nodded, not because she fully understood, but because she wanted to. Harrison picked up the miniature plane and turned it slowly in his hand, the wooden wings catching the light. For a moment, he seemed far away, like he wasn't in the garage at all, but somewhere up there, above a canyon filled with smoke and flame and the sound of spinning rotors. Emily watched him for a while longer, then stepped back into the night, leaving the door slightly ajar. Behind her, the old map stayed pinned to the wall, untouched, but its lines had already started to tell a story, one that was waiting, quietly, to be heard. The library was quieter than usual, its aisles filled with the hushed sound of pages turning and chairs sliding over carpet. But in the corner by the big windows, where sunlight slanted across the reading tables, the air was thick with something else. Madison sat perched on the edge of a chair like a queen on a borrowed throne, her phone in one hand and a smirk tugging at her lip-glossed mouth. Tyler leaned over her shoulder, laughing too loud for a place meant for silence. "Seriously, have you seen that jacket?" he said. "It's like she found it in a dumpster behind an airbase." Madison grinned. "My dad said her grandpa used to be an actor, right? So maybe he thinks he's still in a movie. Like pretending to be some war hero or something. More like cosplay gone sad," Tyler muttered. "I'm just waiting for her to salute someone." Across the room, Emily sat alone at the end of a row, her hands folded on a copy of Amelia Earhart's biography. She wasn't reading, not really. She was listening, every word landing like static behind her eyes. The jacket, draped over the back of her chair, looked heavier than usual, like it had absorbed the weight of their voices. Madison snapped a photo without even pretending to be subtle. "Let's see what the internet thinks," she whispered. Caption, "Stolen valor or just delusional." She did tag Emily's name, she didn't have to. Everyone in the room already knew who it was. Laughter circled the corner like smoke from a fire, thin at first, but catching fast. "She says her grandpa was a pilot," someone added from another table. "More like a retired lawnmower mechanic." Emily didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the page, but the words blurred, ran together, dissolved. Her fingers dug into the edge of the book. She kept her face blank. That was the trick. If you didn't react, they got bored. If you stayed still, maybe they'd forget you were there. But the fire didn't go out. Not this time. Tyler pulled up a video on his phone. A shaky recording from a few years ago, Harrison Ford speaking at some rural aviation event. "See, he talks like he thinks he's Indiana Jones in real life." Madison laughed. "I told you. He probably wears the jacket too, when no one's looking." At the edge of the library, a woman in her late 60s stood quietly between the shelves. Evelyn Phillips, former Army nurse, now a volunteer tutor for struggling readers, had been shelving history books when the first whispers reached her. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but her eyes, trained by years of battlefield triage and broken truths, fixed on the jacket hanging behind Emily's chair. She took a single step closer, her breath caught. The patch, faded almost to nothing, was still there. Not just thread and cloth, not decoration. She had seen it once, long ago, sewn to the chest of a man bleeding out in a medevac chopper, his hand still gripping a flight helmet. Her throat tightened. Most kids wouldn't recognize that symbol now, most adults either, but she remembered, and she remembered what it meant. Madison was still talking. She's probably just making it all up for sympathy, you know, pity points. Crying in the bathroom, so teachers give her easier grades. Emily didn't flinch, but something inside her shifted, like a pane of glass hit by too much pressure, cracks spiderwebbing just beneath the surface. At the far end of the room, Evelyn stepped back into the shadows. She didn't say a word, not yet, but her jaw was set and her hands curled slightly at her sides. She had seen this kind of ignorance before. It came in different uniforms, different names, but the harm it caused, it was always the same, and sometimes it took more than silence to fix it. Sometimes it took a voice, one that knew exactly what that patch stood for, even if the world had forgotten. Rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythms, soft at first, then harder, like fingers drumming on glass. The wind made the pine trees outside groan and shift, their shadows stretching across the cabin walls. Inside, the clock read 2:17 a.m., but Emily was wide awake, her eyes open in the dark, the thin blanket clutched tightly under her chin. The nightmare had shaken her, voices laughing, pointing, the jacket pulled from her shoulders in front of the entire school. She couldn't breathe, even after waking. She slipped out of bed without making a sound, her bare feet quiet on the wooden floor, and padded down the narrow hallway toward the back of the cabin. The light in the workshop was already on. Harrison Ford sat at the workbench, sleeves rolled, glasses perched low on his nose, sanding the edge of a wooden wing with deliberate care. The storm didn't seem to reach him. He looked up only when Emily pushed the door open slowly, the hinges sighing. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't have to. She stood in the doorway, eyes wide, hair a little damp from the hallway window she'd leaned against. Her voice cracked before she got the words out. "If they say you're lying, that you made it all up, who should I believe?" Harrison set down the sanding block. His eyes met hers, calm and steady. "Did I ever lie to you?" he asked. She shook her head. He stood, wiping his hands on an old rag, and walked past her without a word. In the far corner of the workshop was an old chest, wooden, low to the ground, its brass latches dulled by years of dust. Harrison crouched slowly, opened the bottom drawer of a shelf nearby, and pulled out a key. The lock clicked once, sharp and quiet. He opened the chest. Emily stepped closer. The lid creaked open, revealing carefully packed folders, envelopes, a folded American flag still crisp at the corners. Harrison moved aside a leather-bound logbook and lifted out a laminated newspaper clipping. He handed it to her without a word. The headline read, "Helicopter pilot rescues 6 firefighters trapped in Snake River blaze." Below it, a grainy photo showed a chopper hovering above smoke, rotors slicing through ash. "That was 2001, he said quietly. Wind was up, visibility near zero. They were calling it impossible." He paused. They weren't wrong. Emily stared at the article, then at the next item he handed her, a metal badge with the words Air Rescue etched deep across its center. It was scuffed, edges worn smooth from handling, but the engraving still gleamed under the workbench light. And then he reached into the bottom of the chest and pulled out a small cloth pouch. From it, he unfolded a second patch, identical in shape to the one on her jacket, but this one still bright with the faintest remnants of red and gold. She gasped softly. "This is the same," she whispered. "It's not a souvenir," Harrison said. "It's earned, and I didn't wear it for the world to clap." Emily looked up at him, eyes wide, confusion and awe warring inside her. "But why didn't you tell anyone?" He breathed through his nose, slow and controlled. Then his voice came low, almost tired. "Because stories fade. People listen for 5 minutes, then scroll on. But what you wear, what you carry with you, that stays. And if you do it right, it speaks louder than words ever could. Emily sat on the stool beside him, jacket still wrapped around her like a shield, but now it felt different. He didn't reach out, he didn't ruffle her hair or squeeze her shoulder, but the space between them shifted like the air itself had changed weight. She looked down at the badge in her hands, then at the patch, and finally at the article. She traced the date with her finger. "This isn't just a jacket," she said. Harrison looked at her, and something passed behind his eyes, something old, buried, but still burning. "No," he said, "it's not." And outside, the rain kept falling, but the storm inside had grown quiet. The posters went up on Monday, bright red and blue with white block letters, "Local Heroes Assembly, honoring those who serve." They were taped to every hallway wall and pinned outside every classroom door. Emily saw them before the bell even rang. Her stomach tightened as she read the date. Friday, 3 days from now. Inside the teacher's lounge, Evelyn Phillips leaned across a table, her voice low and firm as she spoke to Principal Mayers and 2 other staff members. She didn't need notes. She didn't speak for applause. She simply told them the truth. About a man who once flew through a firestorm to pull 6 firefighters off a cliff they weren't supposed to survive. About a name that no one in Grayson Hills remembered, at least not for the right reasons. Harrison Ford. She said it without flinching. The principal raised an eyebrow. "Isn't he that old guy who lives out near Timber Ridge?" Evelyn nodded once. "The same, but what he's done, that's what your students should be hearing." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it passed. By lunchtime, the new program sheets were being printed, the names of local veterans and rescue workers typed neatly beneath the title. And halfway down the list, between a retired police officer and a paramedic, it read, "Guest speaker, Mr. Harrison Ford, former air rescue pilot." Madison Jenkins was the first to spot it. She leaned over the paper tacked beside the office and laughed, loud enough for 3 other kids to turn. "You've got to be kidding," she said. "That guy, the one with the giant dog and the tomato garden?" Tyler joined her. "Maybe they're giving awards for Best Backyard Scarecrow." Emily stood a few steps away, her tray still in her hands. She read the name once, then again, and then looked down at the mashed potatoes growing cold under the fluorescent lights. Her hands tightened around the tray's edges. That evening she sat on the edge of her bed, jacket folded across her lap. "They're going to laugh again," she whispered. "If you show up, they'll laugh louder." Harrison sat nearby, eyes on the window where the last light of day was fading behind the trees. "So don't go," he said calmly. "I didn't say you had to." She looked at him, searching his face. "But if I don't, then they win." He didn't answer, just nodded, slow and quiet, like he'd heard that same battle before inside his own head. 300 miles away, in a base office at Fort Yellowstone, a 4-star general scrolled through the scanned list of school events his staff had compiled for Veterans Week. Most of it was routine, marching bands, speeches, essay contests, but one name stopped him, Harrison Ford. He stared at it, silent for a long moment. The room was still. Then he stood. "Get the car ready," he said to his aide. "I'm going to Grayson Hills on Friday." "Sir?" the aide asked. "That's not on the schedule." The general folded the tablet in his hand. His voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of memory. "It is now." And just like that, a name that had nearly disappeared into quiet woods and old map drawers was about to be spoken again. Not just in a school auditorium, but in front of the one man who never forgot what it meant. The gymnasium had been transformed overnight. Rows of folding chairs lined the polished floor, red, white, blue banners draped from the rafters, and a podium stood centered beneath the school's eagle mascot, now adorned with a small American flag. Students filed in by grade level, whispering with the excitement that always came with cancelled math lessons and the promise of something unexpected. Teachers herded classes into place while parents found their seats near the back. The band played one last shaky note before the microphone crackled and Principal Mayers stepped forward to introduce the day's honored guest. Emily sat in the last row of the 5th grade section, her knees together, hands folded in her lap. The jacket felt heavier today, not from weight, but from everything that now lived inside it. She'd almost left it at home, almost, but something made her wear it one more time. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was memory. Or maybe, deep down, she wanted to know what would happen if the truth finally had a voice. General John Carter approached the podium with the steady pace of someone who knew how to command a room without raising his voice. He looked taller in uniform, the rows of medals on his chest catching the gym's overhead lights. The applause faded quickly, students settling as the air thickened with expectation. He began the way they all do: gratitude, sacrifice. Words that fill space without asking too much. He spoke of duty and honor, of those who serve and the families who wait at home. Students listened, teachers nodded. Madison doodled stars in the margin of her program. Tyler nudged the kid beside him. Then it happened. The general paused mid-sentence, his gaze drifting over the crowd as if looking for something he hadn't realized was missing until that very moment. And then he saw it, near the back. A small girl in an old flight jacket. The patch was faded nearly to invisibility, but not to him. His breath caught, his hand dropped from the podium, and for a moment he didn't move. Then, with every eye on him, General Carter straightened, turned to face her fully, and raised his hand in a crisp, practiced salute. Not a casual gesture, not symbolic, a real salute. The kind offered only to those who have earned it or to the families who carry what remains. The gym fell silent, students sat up, teachers froze, Madison's mouth hung open. Tyler leaned forward, whispering, "What the heck is going on?" Emily blinked. She hadn't moved since the moment his eyes met hers. She felt like the room had stopped breathing. The general lowered his hands slowly. Then he turned back to the mic and picked it up again. His voice, when he spoke, had changed, no longer ceremonial. Now it was personal. "There's something I need to say before I go any further," he said, "something not on the program." He looked out at the sea of faces, but his focus never strayed far from the girl in the jacket. "Years ago, I was part of a rescue operation gone wrong. Fire, smoke, poor visibility. We were pinned down in Snake River Canyon. Radio said no one was coming, and then, out of nowhere, a chopper dropped through the clouds. We thought it was suicide. It was. It was a man who didn't wait for orders. A man who saw 6 names about to be forgotten, and chose to do something." He paused. "I don't know how many of you know this, but the man who flew that mission, who brought us out, is sitting right here, Harrison Ford. And if anyone in this room has ever questioned whether that name belongs to a hero's story, let me be clear. I'm only standing here today because of him." Gasps rippled through the audience. Emily felt them like waves against her skin. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her breath came shallow, her hands frozen around the sleeves of the jacket. "And that young girl," the general continued, pointing gently, "is his granddaughter. She wears his jacket not to pretend, not to seek attention, but because she carries what the rest of us can only try to honor: his courage, his sacrifice, and now his legacy." He set the mic down, and for a long moment, no one in the room said a word. Not Madison, not Tyler, not the teachers or the principal, because in 3 seconds everything had changed, not just what they saw, but what they thought they knew. And somewhere beneath all that silence, Emily breathed again. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. Behind the gymnasium curtain, the light dimmed. Applause still echoed beyond the stage, scattered and unsure, like everyone was clapping, but no one quite knew how. Emily stood just behind the podium steps, her legs trembling beneath the weight of the moment. She had barely registered the general's words, but they had settled deep inside her chest, like something warm where the cold used to live. And then the curtain shifted. Harrison Ford stepped forward from the wings, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, like the earth itself had always moved beneath his boots. He wore a plain button-down shirt and worn jeans. No medals, no uniform, just the same quiet presence he carried into every room he didn't ask to enter. General Carter saw him first. Their eyes met across the narrow space, and for a heartbeat no words were spoken, but the silence between them said everything: recognition, respect, something unshakable forged not in ceremony but in fire. Carter extended his hand. Harrison looked at it for a moment, then took it in both of his own. The grip was brief but firm. The general's voice was lower now, intended only for the man in front of him. "You never asked for this," he said, "but you earned it." Harrison gave a faint nod. "Did what needed doing," he replied, "nothing more." Outside the curtain, the room was waiting. General Carter turned back to the microphone. "I'd like to invite someone else to speak," he said. "A man who never planned to be here. A man who flew straight into danger when everyone else turned away." There was a hush, a different kind now, not the silence of shock, but the stillness of attention. Harrison stepped up to the podium. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't unfold a piece of paper. He just rested both hands on either side of the mic and looked out at the crowd. Most of them didn't know what to expect. Some didn't even know what to think. He scanned the room slowly, then his eyes stopped on Emily. She stood near the front row now, jacket still on, her chin lifted but her hands shaking slightly at her sides. He gave her the smallest nod. She didn't smile, but her shoulders straightened. Then he looked out again. "Some people talk a lot about honor," Harrison said. His voice was rough around the edges, like gravel under a boot. "They write it on signs, they give speeches. That's fine." He paused. "But others," he continued, "don't say much. They just fly when they're told not to, land where no one else will, walk into the fire and hope there's still a way out." You could hear the tension leave the room, quietly, like breath held too long finally let go. "I'm not here to talk about myself," he said. "I didn't come to be thanked. I came because there's a girl in this room who's been carrying something heavy, something people thought she had no right to carry." He turned toward Emily. "I gave her that jacket because she asked what it meant to be brave. I didn't give it to make her feel special. I gave it because she already was." He stepped away from the mic then, walked down the stage steps, and stopped beside her. He placed one weathered hand gently on her shoulder. "She doesn't need to prove anything," he said, "not to the room, but to her. She just needs to keep walking the way she's been walking." General Carter returned to the stage, holding something in a wooden box. He opened it and held it toward Emily. "This medal," he said, "was approved years ago, but the man it was meant for never came to collect it. Today, we honor him the right way." Emily took the box with both hands. She didn't speak. She didn't cry, but when she looked down at the bronze star glinting under the lights, something in her finally settled. It wasn't just about the jacket anymore. It was about everything it had survived, and everything she had. 1 month later, the jacket hung behind glass in the front hallway of Grayson Hills Elementary. The patch, still faded, sat just above a small brass plaque that read, "Air Rescue, Snake River Canyon, 2001. Students passed it on their way to class, sometimes slowing down, sometimes silent. No one made jokes anymore, not about old jackets, not about strange girls, not about names they didn't understand. Emily no longer wore the jacket. She didn't need to. That morning, she had put on a plain shirt, buttoned at the collar, the sleeves just a little too long. She walked the same hallways, but the weight on her shoulders had shifted. Lighter now. Not because the burden was gone, but because it was hers. In the lunchroom, Madison hovered near the table, holding her tray like a shield. Her voice, once sharp and certain, now came low and uneven. "I didn't know," she said. "I mean, about your grandpa, I didn't really think." Emily looked up, calm, not angry, just present. Madison cleared her throat. He really was someone." Emily didn't nod. She didn't gloat. She simply gave a small smile. The kind that ends things gently. "Sometimes," she said, "you don't need people to apologize. You just need them to stop being wrong." Madison blinked, then turned and walked away. Not out of shame, but maybe understanding. Or something like it. That evening in the workshop, Emily found an envelope tucked beneath her math book. Folded neatly, the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Her name. Inside was a note, short. Written in black ink on yellowed paper, the edges smudged with oil and time. "People will forget stories. They always do. But if you live by what that patch stands for, they won't forget you." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Emily placed the letter back in the envelope and tucked it into her journal. Outside, the pines swayed in the early autumn wind. Quiet, steady, like the sky had opened and nothing needed saying. The jacket would stay behind glass now. But the legacy, that was going with her. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.